Thank you. Well, I'm very grateful so far for having had a robust discussion and several excellent panels in the morning. I'm particularly happy now for us to get to our luncheon and our keynote. Let me quickly introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Feldstein. I'm the Frank and Bethune Church Chair of Public Affairs at Boise State University. Thank you. I'm delighted that you're all here today. And I, first of all, want to make sure to thank a few of the conference sponsors of the luncheon. So Boise State Public Radio, Idaho Public Television, the Idaho Statesman, and the Micron Foundation. I would also like to thank, together with them, the School of Public Service and the Frank Church Institute Board, who also purchased tables. So please give them a round of applause. I also want to give special thanks to Gary Wensky, who's the Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute and really is the brains behind the operation over here. Very well supported by Chase Johnson, a research associate at the Frank Church Institute, and Gabrielle Beaulieu, who's also providing support and research help for the conference. Finally, Dean Corey Cook of the School of Public Service, as well as President Bob and Kathy Kustra. Thank you again for your support and for attending here today. And now on to our keynote speaker, Ann Richard. I'm personally gratified that Ann is with us here today. And really, I think it's hard to imagine having someone else with more relevant experience and insight than Ann, especially on the topic of refugees, migration, and national security. Ann has worked in the highest levels of government and the NGO community on refugee and migration issues throughout her career. I first met Ann nearly a decade ago when she was a senior official at the IRC. Ann made the unfortunate mistake of wasting her precious attention on meetings with me, failing to realize that as a staffer for an authorizing committee, I had little to no say on actual things that mattered, particularly funding. However, that became the start of a friendship, and I've really appreciated getting to know her throughout the years and learning from her wisdom and experience. More recently, when Ann served as the Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the State Department, I was over in joining the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And I like to think of our bureaus as sort of sister bureaus, and that there are different perspectives, even under the last administration when it comes to foreign policy. Not everyone agrees on the right course of action to take, but I always felt that I had support from her bureau and from Ann herself anytime we were entering into difficult policy discussions on key choices for the country. And so for that, I was especially grateful. Let me say a few more words about Ann's incredibly impressive biography before we welcome her up. She, as I mentioned, most recently served as Assistant Secretary in the State Department from 2012 to 2017. Previously, she was Vice President of Government Relations and Advocacy for the International Rescue Committee. In addition to the State Department, she served at Peace Corps headquarters in the U.S. Office of Management and Budget earlier in her career. She has enjoyed fellowships from the Council on Foreign Relations and the Robert Bosch Stiftung. She is a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and has a master's degree in public policy studies from the University of Chicago. Since leaving the Obama administration in January, she has taught at Georgetown University and is a visiting fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House. Please join me in welcoming Ann Richard, the Honorable Ann Richard, to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be here in Boise, and this is my first time here. And it is true what the Boise Weekly reported, that I grew up surrounded by potato fields that have now all been plowed under for vineyards because of the people of Idaho. So thank you to Boise State University and President Bob Kusta and his wife, and the Frank Church Institute, and the conference organizers, Gary Wensky, Steve, of course, Corey Cook, Chase Johnson, Gabrielle Ballou, and especially Annika Galliani, who made sure I flew in here. In my remarks today, I want to talk about the many complex crises occurring at the same time around the world. They are lasting too long, and too few are being resolved. I also want to talk about what Americans already do about this, what more we can do, and how, unfortunately, this year our country has abruptly changed course, threatening to abandon some of our traditional ways of engaging with other countries and helping others. The United States has a history of leading and providing humanitarian assistance around the world and championing human rights. Today, however, alliances are questioned, aid budgets proposed for deep cuts, and offices at the State Department and other federal government offices stand empty. Let's start with the fact that there are some 65 million displaced people around the world. More than 40 million of them are uprooted but still inside the borders of their home countries. These are called internally displaced persons, or IDPs. And more than 22 million of the 65 have fled across international borders and are thus legally considered refugees. In the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, countries are hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees, and some take in 1 million or more. In the Western Hemisphere, displaced Colombians pray that a new era of peace can begin. At the same time, young people flee violence in the Northern Triangle countries of Central America and undertake a dangerous trek through Mexico to reach the US border. In Europe, walls have gone up to stop the waves of migrants and refugees, including many refugees from Syria. What do these uprooted people need? First, they need the basics of life necessary for survival: food, clean water, shelter, and medical care. A place to pause and take stock without fear of being shot, bombed, arrested, or persecuted. A chance to heal. As time goes on, they will need more. People who live in refugee camps generally express a desire to go home again. And when they can't, they seek ways to become self-sufficient. As a result, more refugees now live in cities than in camps. They try to make it on their own, trying to earn a living on or off the books, and live as normal a life as possible in places like Cairo, Istanbul, and Bangkok. I am particularly concerned about the plight of refugee children. Girls can end up kept out of society to keep them safe or married off too young in a misguided attempt to protect them, and at an age when doctors and midwives tell us that they are really too young to have children without medical complications. Boys and girls are sent out to work instead of going to school, or they become prostitutes. The answer is education for the children and skills and jobs for refugee adults. During the last year of the Obama administration, we devoted many hours to meeting with other countries to convince them to allow more refugee children to go to school and adult refugees to work. We tried to support, with our aid dollars, getting more kids in classrooms, even as schools in countries like Jordan and Lebanon added second shifts and even third shifts to their school days. We encouraged countries to allow refugees to work, and if they did, agreed to support greater investment in their economies. So some will ask, well, why us? Why do we have to act when these crises are far away? They don't concern us. Let me tell you, we are sowing the seeds of misery for years to come if we allow children to be malnourished and stunted, or young people to be left uneducated, unskilled, and underemployed. if we allow dangerous diseases to spread unchecked and conflicts to go on and on and on, affecting more innocent people. Yes, the rest of the world has to help too. More countries ought to contribute to humanitarian appeals for funds. And that was something that in the Obama administration we were actively trying to do, was to bring more other countries to the table of major donors. And I applaud private sector companies that take an interest and help. And I was very moved when Rafik Sadikovic mentioned the encouragement he got from Micron. And of course, I don't have to tell an audience from Idaho about Hamdi Lukayu and Chobani and how he tries to set jobs aside for refugees. I encourage university students to partner with veterans and church groups and artists and activists to raise money and call attention to people in need. From my time in public service and in my travels around the world, I have come to know that other countries really do take note of what the United States does and says. We can be tremendously influential. Related to this, one of the first actions of the new Trump administration in Washington was to issue an executive order that has become known as the travel ban. It tried to do a number of things, including pausing or suspending the program to resettle refugees in the United States, barring refugees and other travelers from what were originally 7 Muslim-majority countries, and cutting the number of refugees we bring to the United States annually from 85,000 in 2016 to 50,000 in 2017, and not the 110,000 recommended by President Obama for 2017. And in recent weeks, the Trump administration proposed even less for the new fiscal year, 45,000 refugees. The executive order followed through on a campaign promise to some voters and was issued without review by experts and without worrying about its impact on the travelers, who are, of course, not American voters. And some of the travelers, the refugee families among the travelers, are among the most vulnerable, most traumatized people on earth. The stated rationale was that this executive order would enhance U.S. national security. Now, there is absolutely no evidence that this is the case. Many former officials, foreign policy, and national security experts of both parties have gone on record to say that this is not the case, and refugees invited to the United States are among the most heavily vetted of any traveler to our shores. So the court stopped implementation of the first executive order, stopped part of the second issued in March that expired recently, and this month, the third version was also stopped by the courts. The reality is that these travel bans were cooked up as an expression of anti-Muslim sentiment that, while not always overtly acknowledged, is certainly driving the president's actions. It not only won't do anything positive to prevent terrorism in this country, it exacerbates an uneasiness among some Americans who don't know any Muslims, but from hearing about or seeing photos of war and conflict and atrocities and terrorist attacks abroad, have become convinced that the word Muslim equals terrorist. If allowed into the US, the thinking goes, Muslims will take over our country and impose Sharia law. This, of course, is not true. It's not true about Muslims, and it wasn't true when these very similar statements were leveled against other groups years earlier. Here on campus, students studying the wider world know that Islam is one of the world's great religions, and 23% of the world's population is Muslim. In my travels, I have met and admired Muslim aid workers and leaders of relief operations in nearly every corner of the globe. Innocent Muslim families are victims and survivors of terrorists. Muslim neighbors take them in, and they are helped by Muslim charities, Muslims doctors and nurses and teachers and mayors. I have met Muslim refugees who have lost family members to war, including Syrians who fled to Jordan and Lebanon, and a few years earlier, Iraqi families who fled to Syria. I've admired Somali refugee girls going to school in the slums of Kenya, determined to learn and make something of themselves. And I've worried about Rohingya I've met who were persecuted in Burma and then pushed out of that country through the most brutal means to Bangladesh. Tragically, the Rohingya crisis has worsened significantly in recent weeks. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, many of you will remember this, President George W. Bush acknowledged the respect we ought to have for Islam. It's practiced freely by many millions of Americans and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends, he said. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. Indeed, the 3 to 5 million Americans who are Muslim want nothing to do with the murder and mayhem wrought by terrorists. So what is really at work here has very little to do with national security safeguards and more to do with our other tradition, our tradition of being afraid of admitting the latest group of strangers. As Chief Justice Jim Jones and Mohammed Abu Bakr mentioned this morning, in earlier times, Irish immigrants were discriminated against, and then the Southern Europeans were discriminated against. The Chinese Exclusion Act suspended immigration from China for 6 decades. Japanese Americans were under suspicion and interned during World War II. Jewish refugees were turned away during World War II, and those from Eastern Europe and Russia were mistrusted during the Cold War, suspected of being Soviet spies. Majorities of Americans were concerned by Hungarian refugees fleeing in the 1950s, Southeast Asian refugees in the 1970s, and Cubans in 1980. So, should we be surprised when, after terrorist attacks in Paris in November 2015, attacks that were largely planned and carried out by people born in Europe, pollsters discovered that a majority of Americans were against accepting refugees from Syria? 53% of Americans didn't want to accept any Syrian refugees at all. Another 11% would accept only Christian refugees from Syria. Polling suggests the numbers opposed to the refugee program have dropped below 50%, again, as emotions cooled. My question is, where were the cool-headed pragmatists in Washington, D.C., when we needed leaders to help us understand that the refugees are not terrorists, they are the victims of terrorists? Unfortunately, polls drive the views of politicians when we should have leaders who help educate, explain, and put things in perspective for their constituents. Thanks. These immigration and refugee issues I care about, and I'm hoping you do or will care about them, give us only one example of a public policy issue where elected officials in Washington are using so-called alternative facts to undermine the well-being of our communities. If you follow other debates about public policy, from climate to healthcare to tax policy, and no matter which side of the debate you happen to start out on or want to end up on, you will discover the airwaves and websites clogged with bad information and unsound, sometimes even hateful opinion. And I'm particularly troubled that there is so little sympathy for the poor and weak. Many of the issues of our day, most of these discussions touch on or are rooted in our values. Our American experience has been for years an inspiration for others around the world, in part because we have fostered our shared values, what Senator John McCain calls our strength and greatest treasure. These are not necessarily right versus left or Republican versus Democratic Party issues. This is about who we are as Americans, as a country, and as a model of a functioning, albeit imperfect, democracy. Let me conclude, not with a conclusion, but with a question to everyone in attendance today, and yes, even those of you in the overflow room, and especially to students. What are you going to do about this in this historic moment? What are you going to do to make a difference? Everyone involved in this conference put on this morning will tell you, this is an extraordinary time in our history. Will you vote, volunteer, organize, write a letter to the editor, visit your member of Congress, circulate a petition, visit your member of Congress, run for office, visit your member of Congress, help a newly arrived refugee family. Will you stay abreast of current events and help explain them to others? Ask yourself, how am I going to make a difference at this unique point in our history? Don't for a moment think you have no influence. Americans absolutely do. Thank you very much. I will take questions and answers, but I want him to call on people because I don't want to play favorites, you know. I'll call on all the good-looking Idahoans.
What we can do maybe is have folks line up or come up to the microphones here. Maybe that's the easiest way to do it, and then we'll just sort of have the process there.
Hello. So I have a question. I thank you for your remarks, particularly your last set of remarks. What will we do about this? Visit your member of Congress. So I just want to throw out there that, like, my members of Congress literally will not visit with me. Like, I'm a part of a moms group here in Boise that advocates for, you know, different policy situations that we're concerned about, and we have some moms who are stay-at-home moms and are dedicating themselves almost full-time to getting into these offices, getting an audience with these members of Congress, getting them to hold a town hall meeting, and it hasn't happened in the last year. They won't.
Yeah, so what you need to do is to form a coalition with people that they must meet with. So you want to be the stay-at-home moms who hang out with the CEOs of Idaho-based businesses, and the president of the university, and the, you know, school superintendent, and the mayor, and you know, that will make it harder to just pretend that that phone, you know, was cut off in mid-conversation. So, can't hear you, we're losing you. So I think that would be the way. Members will respond to people who have clout in the community among their voters. So in addition to the other things I talked about, petitions and postcard writing campaigns and phone calling campaigns that clog the phone apparatus of the office, so they really can't stop, you know, get work done because they're answering so many phone calls. And letters to the editor usually get a lot of attention from members of Congress. They care about what the local papers are saying. Steve, you worked in an office of a senator. Do you have anything to add, or? Yeah, so I would try to, first off, thank you for what you're doing. And I would say you need some influential friends. All right, my favorite high school student is going to ask a question.
I don't know why I'm always up here. I just happen to be lucky.
Because you're a leader. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I'll say I'm Robert Bratley for the third time from Capitol High School. Go Eagles. And I just wanted to ask that, and it somewhat relates with the question that, I'm sorry, what's your name? Katie, sorry. That Katie asked. Do you see it as a problem that we have to make friends with local CEOs just to be able to talk to our congressmen about such a vital issue? And do you think that we can change that, or do you think that in some ways America's process might have been flawed since the beginning for rich white men? This all affects
Some of my best friends are white men, and not enough of them are rich white men. So I'm not attacking those guys. I think that if you look at the way it's structured to run for Congress, that money plays a big role, and what's decisive is the number of votes, right? So if you can show that you influence how people vote, you will be taken care of. You get the attention of a member of Congress. Right, left, mainstream, it doesn't matter. It's set up to work that way. And so I think that what I'm talking about are tips to reinforce to that member and his or her chief of staff and their other staff that you are not just one person's viewpoint, but you're actually moving and influencing large numbers of voters. And you don't necessarily have to have money to do that. Money is very helpful in many things in life. But if your cause is right and you use, social media tools don't have to be expensive, and you organize, you can potentially really get the attention and the time of a member. What's different in the last year is that the town hall phenomenon turned pretty nasty. And I think before, I don't think they ever had quite been that sort of level of nasty discourse had really prevailed. People who went to town halls tended to be junkies for the political scene. So I think the answer is not to cancel town halls, but just to, really encourage much more dialogue and much more explanation of the complexity of issues, something that you would get, but that not every member of Congress is prepared to do in this environment. They want to say, I'm either this issue, I'm either for it or I'm against it, and not talking about the nuances and the difficulties. And these international issues are very, very complex.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hi.
Hi, my name is Lori Odie. I'm just a community volunteer, but I think a lot of us believe a lot of the problem is with the Electoral College system. And I wonder, I've heard people suggest that maybe we can, I don't know if it would require a constitutional amendment to change the Electoral College where it's proportional votes instead of a winner-take-all system. And I just wonder if you see that there's any possibility that that might happen.
I don't know. I think that the last election raised a lot of questions about the Electoral College system. It's not my expertise. I cannot confirm or deny that I was cussing out the Electoral College last November. Part of the thing is, even in winner take all, I think we're in a very different presidency right now, because I am used to working with people on both sides of the aisle. Refugee policy for a long time had bipartisan support. Republicans who were anti-communist came together with Democrats who, the traditional bleeding heart liberals or whatever, and it was a really strong movement to support refugees. And that has all changed just in the last couple of years in a way that I think is a betrayal of who we are as a nation. And a lot of Republicans agree with that. So I endorse anything Boise State University's political science department wants to do about the Electoral College. And I also encourage Republican leaders to speak up in support of refugees and immigrants. That didn't used to be, a feat of daring in the Republican Party. So I'd like to get us back to bipartisan support for these programs. It's okay to ask questions and, ask about the level of support and the numbers that come in. But right now, it's just such an ugly debate about bringing in terrorists. There was a U.S. senator who told me I should go to the funerals of the people in San Bernardino. And, it's like, do I say they didn't come in through this program when really, and one was born in the U.S., or do I just say, you're lumping together all Muslims, this is horrendous. So I think really that's why I'm so convinced at the core this is a sort of anti-stranger, where they're not seen as people, but they're seen as sort of a threat. And I loved the remarks this morning. Who was talking about the polling data where when people meet refugees, their attitudes towards them? Jan Reeves, very good. That polling showed that if you've met a refugee, you tend to think of them as human beings and be more inclined to Speak of the devil.
Hi, Ann. Thanks for coming to Idaho. You're always welcome here anytime you want to come
Thank
back.
you.
And thanks to Steve for getting you here. I'm Jan Reeves with the Idaho Office for Refugees. And my question has to do with the presidential determination and Donald Trump's partial justification for the low number being that it costs 10 times as much to resettle a refugee in the U.S. as it costs to protect that refugee somewhere overseas. And knowing that countries of asylum are tremendously overburdened and destabilized by massive numbers of people, what is your answer to Donald Trump that balances the need to protect people in place versus the need to resettle them in a third country?
Well, thank you. So the people that we tend to take heretofore, up until this point, have been among the most vulnerable of the world's refugees. And that was very much on purpose. We were taking people who had medical issues that required sort of the type of medical care you could get here in Boise and couldn't get in a refugee camp. We took torture victims. We took female-headed households with young children where the kids would definitely thrive and grow up to be Americans if their mother could survive the first few years here. And so we kind of stacked the deck against success of the program because we were bringing families where at least one member had special needs, the type of thing that American families get help for and that refugee families wouldn't necessarily overseas. And so that is part of what I'm very proud about in this program. The other thing I would explain to people overseas when they complain to me we took so few compared to the very large numbers walking into their countries was that this is a permanent offer. When refugees come to the U.S., after a year they get a green card, and after 5 years they can take the test of citizenship. And when they pass the test, by the way, I'd like, for the Electoral College question, I'd like all members of Congress to pass that test before they take office. When they pass that test, I think it's a good idea. Yeah. When they pass that test, they become a U.S. citizen on the same basis, the same model citizenship, the same rights and responsibilities as all U.S. citizens, whether you were born here or came 20 years ago or came 5 years ago. So that is special, I think, and that's different about us. A lot of countries that take in refugees, they make it very clear it's supposed to be temporary, but for us, it's permanent. When we take in refugees, we show solidarity with countries that have taken in refugees. And so, yes, they would say, oh, you've taken tens of thousands of refugees, that's nothing. And I'd say, yeah, but it adds up, 3.2 million since the Vietnam era. And these refugees enrich our country. I often say that, they will start businesses or buy homes or save towards homes or rent homes in depressed areas of town and really help revitalize that. And I think the mayor this morning said something along those lines about some of the refugees taken in here in Boise. So there's a lot of positives from taking in refugees, and an important one is the symbolism of what we show and demonstrate to the rest of the world. And that's what I think concerns me about Donald Trump saying, oh, well, we can help more overseas with the same money. It's actually true. We can help more overseas with the same money, but at what cost? At what cost to what it says about America are we going to cut back? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Donna Harwood. I'm the executive director of the Lions Pride Unity Center, which works with diversity and cross-cultural awareness. I love it that I'm following Jan. Jan, hi, I haven't seen you in a while. I need to talk to you by the end of the day. Thank you. I think I have more of a comment than a question, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this as well. Over the years, I've been involved with a number of movements separately, and have struggled to find ways to get cross-awareness and cross-involvement in those movements. And what I have to say about where we are now politically, I have never seen such unity in cross-cultural and cross-movement involvement. So I think there's probably a silver lining to everything that we're experiencing here today. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, what are the prospects for the future, given where we are today? I mean, you're a lovely audience, and once again, I'm talking to people who agree with me. I mean, I think it's much harder to talk to people who disagree and to persuade them. And I think if I were someone in Boise who disagreed with me, I'd give more attention to someone local than to me coming in from Washington. So I think we all have to, push ourselves to help accelerate that change that you predict is coming. Sir.
Hi, my name is Gustavo Sagredo. I'm an independent student reporter here at Boise State. My question leans more towards, and this might be showing my ignorance a little bit about the subject, but my question relies more on what's the thought process that goes behind selecting certain cities and certain areas for refugee resettlement? If you could speak to that.
Well, I used to be quite biased. I thought that refugees should be resettled in big cities on the east and west coast. I thought, well, they're cities full of immigrants, and there's public transportation and lots of housing, and they won't be so freaked out. And then I went to Salt Lake City, and I saw that the city was laid out on a grid, mountains on one side, airport on the other, lots of friendly people who had served overseas as Mormon missionaries were very open to talking to foreigners. And I said, I gotta change my bias. I gotta recalibrate. And so I have traveled all over the US, meeting with refugees and meeting with the people who resettle them. I've gone from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon. I'm not kidding. And I have yet to find a place that isn't appropriate to resettle refugees. The one place we don't resettle refugees, the US government, I'm no longer part of it, but I still say we, is in Wyoming. So 49 states are where refugees go. And I guess that's Western humor. I just stumbled into that. And what's important is not sort of where, it's more about the cost of housing and employment statistics. If employers are having a hard time finding workers, then probably that's a good place to send refugees. And if refugees are looking, like all of us, for affordable housing in safe neighborhoods where their kids can go to school. And so they don't, we don't want to bring refugees into places where they're going to get into trouble short term, or that their kids don't have a safe path to school. So it's more about those issues. Jennifer Syme, who spoke on the panel earlier, is the expert on this. Care to add anything? Did I miss anything, Jennifer?
I think the aspect of family reunification, so making sure that refugees are placed in areas where they may have family.
Jennifer's reminding us that some refugees already have family in the U.S., and so one of the priorities is to unite them with the family they already have here, so even if it's a town that doesn't quite have the demographics that I described, they'll probably do better if they're with their family.
And a follow-up is if you ever calculated the reception that you might have faced in terms of these programs relocating to smaller, more heartland cities?
Some rural areas can really use refugees, especially to work in agriculture. Mm-hmm. And the trick there is transportation, right? And so can the refugees get to the jobs, and can they get back home again? Again, do you care to add? I mean, I would be happy sending refugees anywhere, because I really believe Americans are pretty darn welcoming to the refugees overall, despite the current policies of this administration.
So transportation is definitely a big issue. But there's a couple of ways to get around it. Obviously, small loans for people to be able to purchase automobiles is one thing that we do as IRC in some cities. But also, there's ways of working with employees so that people can carpool, groups of refugees can carpool to their employment site, and people are not so dependent on each one of them having to have a car. So there's ways to get
So for those who didn't hear, Jennifer was talking about, sort of small common sense programs to provide loans to refugees to help them buy a car so they can get to work, and also carpooling. And I think sometimes employers will put together carpools, right? Okay, thanks for
Thank
your
you.
questions. And now we hear from, you're the young woman who was a refugee from Congo, is that right?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Therese Itoka. I was recognized earlier by Chief Justice Jones, and I'd like to say a gracious thank you to that. I'm president of the Humanitarian Club at Boise High, and my whole life I've known conflict. My family, we've known conflict. We are from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and since my father was born, it's just been war and continuous war. So I'm wanting to ask, how can the United States, and we talked about systems, how can we shift our system to be one that is working for the crisis that is going on now? Because we've seen a ratification and an incline in the ongoing crisis. So how can we change the political conversation to create systems in countries as to where we can help them?
Yeah, well, the Obama administration had two special envoys, first one and then the other. The first one was Senator Russ Feingold from Wisconsin, and the second was former Congressman Tom Perriello, who were special envoys to the Great Lakes region of Africa, trying to work with similar ambassadors from other countries and, of course, local officials to bring peace to the Great Lakes. And they found it, challenging. Diplomacy is very challenging. So, I don't know where the status of those conversations are right now. I mentioned that some of the offices of the State Department are empty. I know Secretary Tillerson wanted to do away with the special envoys, and no one has been nominated to take my old job. There's someone acting. And most of the assistant secretary spots are empty right now. So without diplomats to engage, and really one of my main points here is to lead. When Americans put somebody forward as an ambassador to the Great Lakes, suddenly all the other major Western countries do too. And that's how we can influence something going on. Now, diplomacy cannot solve what's happened, especially in Eastern Congo, where there's just been a great deal of violence. Congo's the size of Western Europe. I don't know if your school friends realize that you come from, a landmass that it would be as big as a continent elsewhere. And, there's just been a lot of poverty and violence begets violence, including violence against very vulnerable people, violence against women. This was something that I know Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was particularly worried about, and she traveled to Congo. I think she went to Goma. I know she was talking about the Panzi Hospital, to speak out about this type of violence. And this links in with what Mike Young from Mercy Corps was saying earlier about civilians bearing the brunt of these wars. So I'm glad you raised this issue. It's not, you probably don't see it much in the headlines or in the newspapers in the U.S., but and it's probably unfair to say this to you because you've probably been through enough already in your life, or for several lifetimes, but you're, in a way, you serve as an ambassador of sorts here in Boise because you demonstrate to people, that refugees are very approachable, smart people who work hard, So thank you for the part you're playing, and thank you for raising that question here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Elaine, and I'm from Capitol High School. And I am a refugee, and I came from Tanzania. Well, we lived there in a refugee camp where my parent fled from Congo. So, and when we came here, we know there's like a lot of opportunities that we were given, education and so forth and stuff, and resettlement. But the question I'm asking is, so many of our friends, like our family friends and my parents, they've had professions in Africa that was, they knew what they were doing, and they knew what they were good at. But when they came here, they are limited to certain jobs. So I was wondering, is there a way that, as a community, we could come together and help them, use the profession to their best of their abilities? Because it's just that it's limited of what they're doing.
This is an essential question about the program. I'm so glad you raised this. And it has to do with two things. One is the American tradition that when newcomers come to our country, they often are expected to and have to start over at the bottom of the economic ladder. And a lot of people in this room who are born in the United States probably have ancestors who did that. And so that's a normal part of our country. The flip side of that is an issue of human capacity. Are people in our society, really able to function at the top of their abilities and skills? And when we have people who were doctors in other countries, or engineers, or lawyers in other countries, and they come here and they can't practice their professions because they're not certified, it's very frustrating for the individuals. It's also in some ways a loss of talent for us if we have a doctor who is, cleaning hotel rooms. And so the trick, it becomes trying to find ways to help those refugees at the same time that they have to work and get their kids in school and, pay back the loan of money to fly over here, which is a requirement of the program. At the same time they're doing all that, to help them get certified for, if not to practice medicine in the U.S. standard, at least to be on a route to do that, or to be working in a hospital, as sort of a paraprofessional. And so I know that some of the resettlement agencies have those kind of programs. Like I remember seeing an English class, which was English in the vocabulary of healthcare for refugees, so that they could get jobs, in the healthcare area in the U.S. And so I salute programs like that. They often are the first things cut when there are budget cuts. But I think that kind of smart help to refugees is, I think, the solution there. Thank you for your question. The other thing to say about refugees, and you probably picked up on this from just these last two questioners, refugees are among some of the most resilient people on earth. They have fled terrible things. They have survived. They survived getting to a new country. They survived there. They applied for the U.S. program and survived that process. And then they come here and manage to put down roots. These are not weak people. I've talked about them, families of having vulnerable families, but these are people who are survivors, who are incredibly resilient, and I think we have a lot to learn from them. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Eileen Hale, and I wanted to first commend Therese. Where'd you go, Therese? Who was speaking earlier as the president of the Humanitarian Club at Boise High School. I think it's incredible to see students that have come here as refugees lead our clubs at our high schools. My daughter, I'm privileged to say, was the president of the Humanitarian Club last year as well. And I want to commend all the educators here, the teachers from the high schools, as well as the professors from the university and Dr. Custra for supporting this education. Because I think, thank you. I was part of a movement, if you will, to start a memorandum of agreement a few years ago between the Idaho Office of Refugees and Boise State University. I used to work as a professor here. And we were able to get the refugee certificates program started, which I understand is now a minor in the history department. So I think one of the biggest things we can do for our youth and all of us is become more educated. I agree. Our book out on the table, Half the World, I was asked to contribute a chapter of that. And just a personal testimony, I've worked with Create Common Good to develop the English curriculum to help refugees get jobs here. And I wrote a chapter on one of the refugees who is dear to my heart, who came from Eritrea, survived horrible things. His mother was killed. He had to raise his baby sister. And he now has his own taxi business in Idaho. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and lack of education on how much refugees contribute to our city, our state, and this country. So I thank you for the education that's being done on behalf of our students here at the university. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your comments, and unlike you, I'd like to register a complaint with the educators that the questions that high school students are asking are too hard. Okay. Go ahead.
My name is Gina Finley, and I'm from Global Talent Idaho, which is a program here under the Idaho Office of Refugees that does exactly what I think Galeen was her name, talked about in terms of helping people rebuild their professional careers once they get to Idaho. And so I just want to put that out there, that there is an organization here in Boise that exists. We help people understand the process to relicense if you're a pharmacist, a doctor, an engineer. We also provide coaching and guidance to help people understand, what kinds of jobs can you do that will use your brain power, your capabilities, and your talents while you're going through that long, extensive process to relicense. So students, folks out in the audience, if you know people who've come to the United States as immigrants or refugees, they have professional backgrounds, www.globaltalentidaho.org. Check us out. We provide lots of resources and lots of one-on-one coaching. So just put that out there for everyone.
I think we've gotten our lunch's worth from you, and
It's a long way to come for lunch. It's just like
please join me in thanking Ann Richard for her time today.